stepping from being a director to being a chair is very different in the sense that, you know, the analogy that was given to me and which I have found to be most accurate is that you're the conductor of an orchestra as a chair. And, you know, what you're really trying to do is to seek to leverage the strengths of your board. You're seeking to make sure that you hear from everybody, you know, you have an equal contribution from directors, and that no particular directors are really carrying much more of the load than others. And, you know, and I think you're also trying to make sure that the collective is in harmony.
Hi, I'm Renata Bernarde, and this is the Job Hunting Podcast, where I interview experts and professionals and discuss issues that are important for job hunters and those who are working to advance their careers. So make sure that you subscribe and follow, and let's dive right in. In the last episode, number 104, I started our conversation with Moana Weir, the chair of the Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission in Victoria, discussing her experience building her portfolio of non-executive directorships. In this second part, we will be discussing her role as chair of the commission, and I think it will be a great conversation for two types of listeners. The ones that want to understand that evolution from being a director to being in chair and what that means and the different responsibilities, and how Moana conveys the work of the commission through her public speaking, including in this podcast. So I think it's good to observe how a chair operates and the importance and responsibilities of that role. But it will also be interesting for the listeners that are interested in equal opportunity, diversity and inclusion, human rights in the workplace. We will be discussing a lot of the issues related to the work of that commission and expanding to what's happening not just in Victoria, but all over the world, and looking at issues such as, you know, what's really important for the workplace environment now in light of the pandemic and quarantining, lockdowns, working from home, and all the issues we didn't see coming, frankly, as if we didn't have enough issues to work on to improve human rights and equal opportunity, diversity and inclusion in the workplace. We now have a few more things on our plate, and we do discuss some of those issues as well. So if you're interested in starting your board appointments, understanding what that entails, understanding what you need to do to become a board member, I suggest that you start from part 1, which is episode 104, and then continue to this episode 105. And if you're interested in equal opportunity and human rights in the workplace, this is the episode for you. So stay tuned and listen up. Now, before we go and listen to my conversation with Moana, which I'm sure you will enjoy, I just wanted to remind you to subscribe and follow this podcast. If you have been listening for a while and you're enjoying it, you will make me so happy if you give it a good review, rank it 5 stars, whatever platform you're listening to it. So that would be a dream come true for me. And remember to subscribe to my newsletter. There's a link on my episode show notes. So if you click on the episode show notes, you will find a link to sign up to the newsletter, a link to download the optimized job search schedule. And by subscribing to the newsletter, it means that I'm in touch with you. You can reply back and, you know, ask me questions or find out more about my services. But it also means you get the new episodes of the Job Hunting Podcast every week in your inbox. Plus a few other things that I send specially to my mailing list. So I hope you join us, and without further ado, here's the second part of my conversation with Moana. Now, Moana, now you're a chair.
Yes.
What's the difference between being an executive director and the chair?
Yeah, there's quite a big difference.
It's a whole lot of work.
A big difference, Renata. Yes, and I think it's really interesting because when you're a director of a board, you know, it's very collegiate, it's very collaborative, you're part of a collective, and it's that dynamic is very different to your executive career and your executive dynamic on an executive team. Although, of course, you know, you come from collaborative, hopefully, very collaborative dynamic on the executive side as well. It's a very different dynamic because the decisions of the board are collective decisions. And actually, even if you disagreed with a particular decision, ultimately that will end up being the decision of the board, and then it's your, that is your position as well. So stepping from being a director to being a chair is very different in the sense that, the analogy that was given to me, and which I have found to be most accurate, is that you're the conductor of an orchestra as a chair. And, what you're really trying to do is to seek to leverage the strengths of your board. You're seeking to make sure that you hear from everybody, you have an equal contribution from directors, and that no particular directors are really carrying much more of the load than others. And, and I think you're also trying to make sure that the collective is in harmony to the degree, that that's sort of practicable, because of course you also want to have the voices in the boardroom which are challenging, and the voices in the boardroom which sort of make you think about different perspectives. So, so it is that sort of balancing act. Something that I have found, which was interesting and maybe interesting for your listeners, is, the chair role is not the same as being a CEO in terms of that sort of explicit positional power.
Yeah.
It's a role that you really need to step into the authority of that role much more intentionally, in my experience, than when you're, the CEO, and there's kind of an explicit understanding of the sort of positional authority of that role. When you're the chair and you've been a director, and so you've been involved in that sort of collaborative collective. When you become the chair, it's a moment where you need to adjust to your new role and sort of step much more intentionally into that position.
And is there a lot of forward thinking about the composition of future board members and succession planning for you? Are you also thinking about forecasting and sort of risk managing those situations?
Yes. So we have a board skills matrix, as many, if not most boards have now. And so that's a very good way to think about, the skills that are needed. And we're also very explicit. I mean, I'm chair of the Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. So as you'd expect, we're very explicit about the personal attributes and trying to ensure that we reflect the diversity in the community, in, sort of diversity on the board as well. So there are those requirements and issues we think about as well.
And with all of that experience, I'm very fascinated with the decision-making at the board member and the agenda. That's sort of the culture. It's almost like the way that the organization sets up an agenda for board meetings reflects the culture of that organization in a way.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's an
what
interesting
is the best
observation.
agenda for you? How do you, like, as a chair now, what do you think is your the agenda that works best for your style of leadership?
Yeah, so it's been a sort of organic process of working out what has worked best. We always have an in-camera sort of board discussion at the start of every board meeting, which has been really helpful. So it's a board that doesn't meet that often. It's sort of once every 2 months, and quite a lot may have happened between board meetings. So it gives me an opportunity to sort of update directors if I haven't spoken to them about particular issues between meetings, but also just to get a gauge of how directors are feeling about what's on the agenda, what the content of the papers, and it gives me an opportunity to sort of guide the meeting appropriately. So if I get a sense that there is a particular issue, and I generally will have this sense before I have this conversation, but if I get a sense that there is a particular discussion where we need to spend more time, then I can guide the meeting in that way. And so we then also I give a chair's update, and the commissioner, who's the CEO equivalent, gives a commissioner update. And that's an opportunity for particularly the commissioner to speak in a sort of less transactional way, a much more strategic way about sort of what's really on her mind. And it just makes sure that we can direct the conversation to cover those sorts of areas, because we also have the rotating agenda items which ensure that we cover off all the board business that we need to do from a governance oversight perspective annually. But we don't want to be so tied to that we don't get to the real issues, which are really keeping the commissioner up at night, is my view. So that's why we've sort of landed on that approach.
And how do you think is the best way to operate that relationship with the CEO, the chair and the CEO? Is it, very frequent, or is it very hands-off?
So we speak very often, and, during the pandemic, the Commission has never been busier. And I think that's probably the case of many organisations. And we have so last year we had monthly updates for the board, and it was particularly to hear about the response to the pandemic and just the health and safety and wellbeing of the team. And, those are things that we weave into our normal board meetings this year. But last year in particular, it was quite an intense period for the Commission, and we did need those frequent board updates. And in addition, I spoke to the Commissioner very frequently. So I would speak to the Commissioner weekly and on an exceptions basis. So if there are things that she thinks need to come to my attention, or I think there are things I need to flag with her, we will catch up. And so I think, it is dependent again on the nature of the organisation and what are the issues that you're dealing with at that time. At the moment, there's a lot of human rights issues which are resonating with the community. And so, we do speak quite frequently.
Okay, I'd love to almost sort of change gears a little bit now, if you have time, and talk about the work of the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. Tell the listeners about the work that they do and you do. And is it common for states and territories and countries to have equal opportunity and human rights commission? I'm trying to find the counterparts everywhere so people that are listening overseas can then relate.
Yes.
In their countries to equivalent commissions or institutions.
Yes. So in Australia, there are other state organisations or commissions which are equivalent to us. Not exactly the same, because because of the statutory environment differs state to state. So in Victoria, we have 3 pieces of key legislation which inform the work of the Commission: the Equal Opportunity Act, the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, and the Human Rights Charter. And in different states, there are different sort of statutory environments. At the federal level, we also have an Australian Human Rights Commission at the federal level. And so that's really the layout in Australia. I think in other countries internationally, in some countries there are sort of equivalent state organisations with an overarching federal structure. In some countries it's just the federal sort of structure, but it very much depends, I think, on, the history of those countries and, the way they've responded to various human rights issues that have come up. So it's quite contextual. But I think, in Australia, we're quite well served in that way, and certainly in Victoria.
I was going to say about the Victorian one, because I don't know if it's because I live here, but it seems to me that it leads the way. Does it?
In terms of
the work that they do in the Human Rights Charter, was it the first charter at the state level?
Human Rights Charter, yes.
It was, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yes, that's right. But yes, no, I believe that's right.
I used to be in governance, so I remember having to adapt a lot of things once it came out.
Yes, yes. And look, obviously we're very proud of the Victorian Commission and the role of human rights in this state. And, so the role of the Commission is really as a regulator, but it's also as an educator. And, some of the work that we're most proud of is the sort of systemic reviews that the Commission has conducted, which have really tried to identify and tackle systemic issues, barriers to equal opportunity. So we've done a report and review with VicPol, and we're working together with the Ambulance Victoria at the moment to sort of do work in those areas. And we're particularly proud of that, because I guess it's, the role as regulator is great in terms of enforcing the law and making sure that compliance is addressed in terms of equal opportunity. But it's, the opportunity to really impact the community positively extends beyond that to addressing these systemic issues and really embedding the right culture in organisations and in the broader community.
I'm not surprised that they chose you as a chair, because you have such great corporate experience and board experience prior to taking on a chair role with the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. But do you also feel like you have experience dealing with equal opportunity throughout your life, that you had that lived experience that you could then, and is that needed at the board level?
I think it's helpful. Yeah, so my cultural background is that I was born in Tonga, and we came to Australia when I was 3. And, and actually in my corporate life and in executive life, I have run, sort of equality, diversity and inclusion programs. And I think that is really helpful, both having lived experience, but also having actually experienced in the corporate environment or in any environment, actually, trying to sort of run these programs and trying to work through what works practically in affecting change in this area. So, yeah, I think those things were certainly really helpful.
And what does it mean to have that equal opportunity in the workplace, if we're talking about workplace and not in general? What do you think are the key issues for 2021 and beyond?
So I think, there's been a bit of a reckoning, hasn't there, over the pandemic, and we've had the Me Too movement in Australia. We've had the Brittany Higgins, Grace Tame sort of led further development of that movement with a particularly Australian context. We've also had the Black Lives Matters movement. It has felt like a tipping point in various human rights areas has been struck. And I think sort of largely in response actually to this global pandemic and this removal of a psychological safety net for, all of us. Yes. And this realisation that perhaps there are parts of our world and our culture which could be better. So, I think it's, these issues absolutely impact us in Victoria as they have globally.
What has the pandemic, what sort of layers have the pandemic added to the workload of the Commission? I'm very curious to know what has been the biggest impact on equal opportunity and human rights as we go into lockdown and quarantining and all of that. It'll be interesting to see what people are sort of feeling and how that's translating into work for you.
So we did have an increase, unfortunately, in complaints based on racial discrimination and particularly in the early days of the pandemic, there was real anti-Asian sentiment expressed in the community, which was really unfortunate and, had a really terrible impact on those communities. So we have had, I suppose, a bit of a change in profile of complaints and an increase in complaints in particular areas which have responded to developments directly from the pandemic. More recently, masks and vaccine mandates have become issues for the community. And so those are things that the Commission is spending time focusing on as well. And I suppose just more generally, there's the fatigue, there's the uncertainty, there's the mental health impacts of just this very sort of extended period of dealing with lockdowns and the pandemic public health response, and the Commission supporting multicultural communities, trying to ensure that we can support the Victorian government in terms of resources which are in appropriate sort of languages, and working together with multicultural communities to really make sure that the messaging around public health response is appropriately framed.
I'm very interested in the actual work of the Commission in terms of it macro level and micro level. So if anyone is experiencing inequity or has been harassed or there's an issue in the workplace, they can come to the Commission and lodge a complaint. Is that correct?
They can. So the way the Equal Opportunity Act works is there are a list of protected attributes, and they cover things like, religion, sexuality, age, disability. So there are a list of protected attributes, and particularly in the areas of employment and provision of goods and services, they offer an avenue for people who, if they have a complaint or a dispute, can bring that matter to the Commission.
What happens next, Moana, once the complaint is made?
So now I won't be at all as well qualified to speak to this as our very talented Commission team, but they bring the matter to the Commission, and they will have a member of our dispute resolution team look at the complaint and then facilitate a conversation. And, if the grounds are there, under the Act, they might facilitate, a mediation
Yeah.
with the other side and really sort of conduct a facilitated process to try and reach a resolution.
And then on the other hand, the Commission also has this macro sort of influence on policy and with its recommendations and reports, right? So it's working at the macro level. What are the key issues now in terms of equal opportunity and human rights in the world? I mean, if you had to, choose a few, what would you say are the most important issues for us to think about and solve?
Yeah, well, there's so many, Renata.
Are there any lower hanging fruits that we can have quick wins?
There's so many. Look, and it's not just within the purview of the Commission. Of course, we've got some great other commissioners, even in the Victorian context, and other organisations that are also at the forefront of this work. But certainly gender inequality, and I guess I'm thinking of the impacts of the pandemic and where they have been particularly felt. So certainly gender inequality is still high on the list. Racial inequality is high on the list. Our First Nations communities and our response, our public health response in that area, that's very much top of mind. Disability still very much at the top of the list. And, I know certainly in prior years, the area of disability is where we've had the most complaints in terms of community impacts of discrimination. And religion, faith, faith issues. I think that's also been something that has been surfaced through the pandemic response. So look, I haven't really narrowed the list at all. And age-based discrimination, there's been
I'm glad you mentioned that. Because, this podcast is listened to by a lot of executives that are aging, getting wiser, and they do feel that in the recruitment and selection process.
Yes.
They do worry about the ageism.
Yes, and, and I think there was a report recently, wasn't there, which was speaking to sort of attitudes, and I think it was particularly in the sort of corporate space, but, reflecting this attitude that, having a different response to people at the, who are aging, as you've said, in the employment context is actually largely, still prevalent, unfortunately. So I will say, Renata, I heard your interview with Carly and Alessandro.
Yes.
Which was fantastic. Just, I got a lot out of it and really enjoyed that conversation. And, you were talking about the sort of barriers to their gender inequality, but I think it can apply more broadly than this. But, these behavioural barriers, this sort of deep and, the sort of cultural conditioning and behavioural barriers, these are the things that, in my experience, are very hard to identify and very hard to, fix as a result. Yeah. And I think it's really, one of the key reasons why there's no silver bullet to really, addressing any of these factors in the workplace, because all of us are the product of that conditioning, and we may be very unconscious that it's playing out in our decision making. And so, I think age discrimination is largely hidden, and I think that's one of the areas where this sort of deep ingrained bias and behavioural bias can really impact, unfortunately.
I'd love you to listen to an episode I did with the CEO of Pitch Me, which is a recruitment and selection platform, I believe UK-based, but working globally. And she does not have any photos or videos or age or dates anywhere. And that's really to remove all of those proxies that may lead people to make decisions based on their biases. And I asked her, do you think you're going to move into video? And she said, no, possibly not.
Well, I love the sound of that. Yeah.
I was very surprised because so many people are moving into this sort of software video interviewing formats and, doing analysis with AI of people's body the sort of the body language and trying to read those and identify them is so scary for some of my clients who don't smile that much. And it doesn't mean that they're bad people, you know? If you're interested in that sort of thing, listeners, I will link below a recent book from Malcolm Gladwell on this issue of people passing judgment on others because of the way that they speak or say things. And Malcolm Gladwell himself, if you see him on video, he's very plain, and you know, he doesn't have a lot of expressions. And he was interested from a personal perspective on the issue, and then he wrote a book about it. It's fascinating.
I'd be really interested. And, you know, that there is all that body of evidence now that AI is itself, because of course it's written by humans, is itself implicitly biased. So, you know, the way in which we're using AI is, you know, there's a body of evidence to support that now. So, yeah, I'd be really interested in hearing that.
Yes. So the sort of, you know, work that I do, Moana, is really interesting because I don't like the structure that we have, but I have to teach people how to succeed with the rules of the game that are happening right now. So I often tell them, remember to use your hands. Remember Julia Gillard? Just do that training, because especially now, so many of us are in lockdown and doing video interviews. It's really fascinating to see very experienced executives not showcase executive presence on video because it's not the format that they're used to. They're used to boardroom meetings, you know, and face-to-face meetings. So it's that transition is hard on some people. That doesn't mean that they are not going to perform at the job.
Yes.
Right. So it's yes. But it means that they need to get used to that tool, because it will be the leadership tool of the future. They will probably be leading from a distance, and they will need to get used and need to get better on video.
Yes.
Something to do. Before we go, I'd love to, it's such a difficult topic, but we've spoken about this before. And, you know, you have both this amazing corporate career where you may have experienced or felt this, and now you're at this chair level where you are, you know, receiving all of these complaints. And I'm wondering if it's coming to you. I'm a coach that deals with people in between jobs. You know, they're in transition, right? And of course, there's that grieving phase where they really are so saddened about the fact that they left the jobs. I mean, some of them, not all, but many of my clients have been made redundant or left the jobs in circumstances that were beyond their control, only to then a few weeks later realize that they hated it. And they were, I mean, was that bullying, Renata? You know, what was that? And looking back, you know, and replaying. This week we had a session. I do group coaching, and we discussed this idea that we replay in our minds things that have happened in the past. And we start to understand that was not okay. And it could be that what we did was not okay, but most times it's, wow, the way that happened to me, that was not okay. Have you had that personal experience as well of thinking, gosh, well, how did I cope with this for so long and didn't realize it wasn't okay? And what do you do about that, you know, once you do realize that something was deeply wrong?
Yes, it has happened to me. And I think it's probably a very rare executive who would say it's never happened to them. So it has happened to me. I realised as it was happening, fortunately for me, but I did something that I just would naturally always do. And then since then, I've done more reading and sort of had more life experience and have realised that it actually is a very effective strategy. And that was, I reached out to other executives, and you know, I had very strong connections and relationships with other executives, and you know, I asked them, were they experiencing the same thing, or was it just me? And because when this sort of behavior happens, what can happen as sort of one of the first responses is that you feel very isolated, and you feel that it's potentially something to do with your performance. And so, you know, for me, I mean, this was just a very natural response. It's something I'd always do, but it was very helpful. And what I immediately heard and understood is it was not just me. There were a number of other executives experiencing the same sort of behaviour and the same responses. And, and that sort of, I suppose, alliance, I mean, firstly, it just made me feel, it normalised the experience for me. And it made me feel that it wasn't just my performance, and it actually wasn't my performance. It was things beyond that. But it also gave us all a bit of a platform to sort of collectively sort of change the dynamic and improve the dynamic for ourselves. So that is probably the clear example I have in my mind when you ask me, have I experienced behaviour like that? And so in terms of being able to reflect on it, and, how I would behave if it ever happened again, I probably would do something similar, and I would probably give advice to other executives to do something similar. And I think also, that curiosity piece, again, I think reading widely and actually trying to understand what is happening, trying to sort of intellectually, I'm someone that, that appeals to trying to actually sort of understand in your rational mind and not just your emotional at an emotional response level, what is happening and can I identify this behaviour, and is it that sort of corporate misbehaviour that I've heard of previously? Is it at that level? I think those things are helpful.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I love books like that, and I often recommend the No Asshole Rule, which has been rewritten several times, and it's getting better and better. And there's another one called Working with Monsters from an academic from Sydney.
Oh, I haven't heard of that.
And at the time, this is a long time ago, and my manager was a total monster, and I was talking about this book to some colleagues at the kitchen, in the kitchen, because I was a research officer, so it was part of my research to read about this. I was told to read it, and she definitely thought I was talking about her. She called me in the office. It's like, I really don't like the way that you're like, no.
It was not that.
This was the research that we're doing for Southern Health, by the way. And it was really funny. But yeah, so there are great books out there. And this Working with Monsters is really well researched and an excellent Australian book. So if you're interested, I'll put a link below. Anyone who's listening and wants to read it. Moana, do you think now your career will be a portfolio one and you're going to get more boards and entering roles? Is that what you see happening for you?
Look, I'm open, Renata. I'm open to an executive, another full-time executive role, and to potentially sort of moving into the sort of for-profit listed company space for directorships at the same time, or moving to more of a portfolio mix. But, I have clear in my mind the sorts of organisations that play to my strengths and where I feel, I can add most value. And so I've got that sort of guiding light in mind, and I'll see, what's out in the market. But it feels like it's quite buoyant in the market, and there's some interesting opportunities. So I'm trying to keep an open mind.
Excellent. I wish you all the best. I'm here for you if you need any help.
Thank you.
Don't forget to give me a call. I'd love to support you.
I'd love to.
When you're doing that due diligence and you're asking people what they think, that's a good time to give me a call.
Oh, I'd love to. And look, I wanted to say at some point in this conversation, and I haven't said it, I've just realised that one of the game changers for me as an executive, and I think, one of the most impactful learnings for me has been to understand that I'm really managing my energy, not my time. And, if you think about things in that framework, it really does change things. And, it comes back to this question we've been exploring about how do you balance a non-executive and an executive career, because, let's face it, sometimes it's pretty big burden you've got. You're managing there, and things sort of are requiring you to dial it up in the non-executive space at the same time as you're being asked to dial things up in the executive space, and that can be quite a lot to take on. But I think if you're thinking about your life and your career in terms of managing your energy, and what you've taken on in the non-executive space whilst you're still an executive gives you energy, then, that's a very different way to think about things and to think about taking on opportunities that come your way.
I love that. I love that you're mentioning it. A few weeks back there, I will link below as well. There's an episode about it. What most successful people have in common. It's that very good understanding of time. It's all about time and having the time for the right things, or the right things to you, what it means to you to be successful, what it means to you to invest time into something.
Yeah.
And that's so important. And I think you're a very good time manager. Just having had those amazing breaks, going to Paris, coming back, having time out to go traveling with your son. I mean, a lot of people go through their careers as if they were running a marathon nonstop.
Yes,
and I
think it's well, I think so, and I think it's understanding your non-negotiables, and I think it's also actually valuing your own emotional and physical health, because unless you have that, it's very difficult to lead other people to make sure that they can achieve their potential and also maximise their own energy. So I think. And, I certainly have not always had that. That is something I've had to learn over my career, and I've certainly sort of overcommitted on the time front and not understood how best to manage my energy. That's something that's come later in my career, but it has been a game changer for me. So I wanted to mention it because I think it just gives you a lot of the time you might look at what you've got on your plate and you might think, I'm going to take out those things because it's taking up too much time. But if you think about what actually gives you energy,
yes.
It might be those things that you're looking at chopping out, like exercise, like catching up with your family and your friends, those sorts of things which are actually essential to your well-being, not the things to chop out.
Moana, thank you so much once again. Wishing you all the best, and
thank you, Renata.
We can eventually catch up in person. That would be lovely.
That would be really lovely. Yes, absolutely.
All right, I'll let you know when the episode is out. It will be in a couple of weeks.
Okay, great.
I'm taking 2 weeks off.
Excellent. Are you going to do anything? Or?
Of course not. Just to stay home. I'm just thinking, my son just told me I need to watch Ted Lasso.
Oh, yes, I've heard that too. Yeah, same with me.
I'm going to like it. And
I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I find it fascinating, and I have a couple of other interviews coming up with people with portfolio careers, such as people that have advisory roles, interim executive appointments, and board appointments. So if you're interested, don't forget to subscribe and keep following. Bye for now.